Drums are the backbone of every great metal recording. But if they're sloppy, loose, and out of time, that's a fast track to an amateur sounding mix. Today, I'm going to be jumping into the DAW and going over my step-by-step process for editing metal drums inside of Reaper. I'm going to cover fixing phase issues, removing bleed from the close mics, quantizing the drums, and setting up MIDI for sample reinforcement. These are the steps I use with every client I mix. Huge thanks to Arms Like Teeth for letting me use their song for this tutorial, and Eric from Theropod Underground for doing such an awesome job recording the drums. There'll be a link to both in the description. So let's get into it. Phase issues will destroy your drum sound before you even start. Let's jump into the DAW and see how I tackle it. So I have all my drum tracks loaded in Reaper, and just a quick rundown of the tracks we have. We got a kick in mic, kick out. We have snare top, snare bottom, 3 rack toms and a floor tom, a stereo overhead. We have a hi-hat mic, ride, splash, china, and then stereo rooms. So just kind of listen back to the raw drums here. We have this. So tight drummer, but obviously can use some tightening up. First thing I need to do is check the phase of the drum mics, and I do that in stages. The first thing I'm going to do is for the shells themselves, if there's 2 mics on a shell, like in this case there's 2 kick mics and there's 2 snare mics, I'm going to make sure that those 2 mics are in phase with each other, and then after I do that, I'll go through each one, kick, snare, and all the toms, and make sure they're in phase with the overheads. First thing we're going to look at is the kick in and kick out mic and checking the phase between the two of them. And then just looking at the waveform, you could already tell they're out of phase with each other. That kick in mic, you can see how the waveform is peaking up here, but on the kick out, it's going down. But let's just listen to what the kicks sound like together, and then I'll toggle the phase of the kick in mic, and you could hear the difference. So here it is, just how it was recorded. I'll play it and loop it, and I'll go back and forth between turning it on and off, and just really pay attention to how the low end sounds on the kick when I flip the phase. So here it is first with the phase, how it was recorded. So you notice when I flip that phase on that kick in mic, there's so much more weight and low end to that kick because now you got them in phase. So I'll do that first on the kick. Now I'll do the same thing on the snare. So let's just take a quick look at the snare there and that same section. Visually, these already look pretty much like they're in phase with each other, but let's just listen back and then I'll do the same thing. I'll toggle it with the phase how it is, and then I'll invert the phase. Yeah, so when I flip the phase on that one, you could hear how it instantly gets weaker, that snare. So I'm going to leave that how it is since they seem to be in phase with each other. The next thing I'll do is check the phase of the drums in relation to the overheads. So I'm going to loop that same section on the snare, and I'll play it back this time with the overheads going, and I'm just going to play it how it was recorded, and then I'll toggle the phase back and forth and see if one should sound better than the other. So yeah, when I flip the phase, the snare instantly sounds fuller and has more power to it. So that's how I'm going to leave that. And we'll do the same thing for the kick. Yeah, leaving it how it is without switching the phase, it definitely sounded fuller like that, so that's how we're going to leave that. And then I would do the same thing for each of the individual toms. Excessive mic bleed will make mixing drums an absolute nightmare. Let me show you how I use the plugin DeBleed to remove bleed from all my close mics on the drums. Next thing I'm going to be looking to do is removing the bleed from the individual tracks, so the kick, snare, and toms. What I'm going to be using is, in this case, I'm using DeBleed, but I've also used a silencer. That works really well too. For the kick, I have it set where it's removing quite a bit of bleed, and I have a quick release and very quick hold because for the kick drum, I'm not looking for a ton of sustain on a kick drum for a metal track like this. Then what I do is I just adjust the threshold so that it's just catching those peaks on the kick without grabbing anything else. So I'll show you what it sounds like with that off, and then I'll turn it on. So you can hear how that does a really good job of getting rid of the snare and cymbal bleed. And then I do the same thing on the kick out mic, so I'll show you what that sounds like with it off and then back on. Now this drummer is a very consistent player. You could see how basically all his kick hits are pretty much the same velocity. So in this case, you could pretty much just set it at a threshold and forget it, but I'll still go through it, make sure it doesn't miss anything or it doesn't trigger when it's not supposed to. And now going on to the snare. The snare is going to be a little bit of a different story. It's way more dynamic, as you can see here. So my settings that I usually have, a little bit less on the DeBleed. I want a little bit more of that high end coming through. A longer release because there's more sustain to the snare and I want that coming through. And I set the threshold so it's pretty much triggering correctly for most of the time. And then I have it set up where I could automate when there's ghost notes or if I have to adjust the threshold at all if it's missing certain things. But let's listen to what it sounds like in a section, that same section, with it off and then turned on. Big difference. Now with the snare, like I said, you have to be careful because there's a lot of dynamics. You can see in the beginning here, there's a lot of shallow hits he's doing. So if I play just that section and then turn that on, see how it's missing that part there. So I'll usually automate the threshold, like so for in that section there, bring it down so it's, yeah. And so I'll go through the whole song like that, and then if there's any areas where there's ghost notes, I have it set up where I'll automate the ghost note feature. So in this section here, he's hitting some ghost notes. I'll show you how I'll address that with the DeBleed. So here it is with DeBleed off. Now if I turn it on, you'll hear those ghost notes disappear. Or they're very faint. So what I'll do is, he's hitting him right here, and I'll just automate this to trigger the ghost note feature. And then we've got this. So now we're not missing those ghost notes. So I'll go through the whole song, following that process on the snare top and snare bottom. Now for the toms, similar process, but in this case you could see on the tracks there's a lot of bleed, particularly of the snare. So what I find in situations like this, I actually just leave the threshold all the way at the top so it's never triggering, and I kind of just manually set it so that I don't miss anything. Because if I left it at one set threshold, it would be falsely triggering so much that I wind up having to go in and fix it anyway. So it's easier to just have it set where it's never triggering and then just manually adjusting it as needed to let those toms come through. I'll show you my settings that I have on DeBleed on this. Going a little more heavy-handed with the DeBleed, so getting more of those cymbals out, and kind of similar how I had the snare with the release, so that there's some sustain there. You'll see how I have the threshold all the way up. What I'll do is I'll go through in an area like this where I can see there's tom hits. I'll highlight it, and I'll automate that threshold down just for that section. Let's see how that sounds. I'll go and do that for every single tom track. And so I'll do that now, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. Now that we got the close mics all cleaned up, it's time to create guide tracks that we're going to use to trigger the stretch markers inside of Reaper. Let's check it out. You can see how the tracks are cleaned up. All that bleed is gone. You could really see it on the toms here. And this makes it a lot easier, not only for mixing, but with the editing, it's much easier to see our drum hits now when we're trying to lock them to the grid. The way I go about editing the drums for timing is I'll duplicate the kick in and snare top mics. So let's duplicate those. Bring them up here. We're going to create guide tracks with these. This is what we're going to be using to trigger the stretch markers in Reaper. For both of these tracks, I'm going to normalize them so we have nice big transients. Then for both of them, I'm going to go through and even add a limiter to get them super consistent. Throw one on the kick, we'll put one on the snare. Let's check out how these two tracks are sounding. Okay, now I'll print that. So we're just using this as our guide to set up those stretch markers. Now, one thing I'll do is go through any time where the kick is hitting at the same time as the snare, and I'll remove those kick hits from the guide track. Now, the reason why I do that is I always prioritize the hands ahead of the kick in terms of locking to the grid. So if the kick and snare are meant to hit at the same time, like they are pretty much throughout this intro, but you see obviously he's slightly out of time between his kick and hand. I don't want stretch markers going for both. It's going to try and compress them all together. It's going to sound weird. So if I have to choose one, I always prioritize the hands. So all these instances where the kick is going at the same time as the snare, I'm going to delete them. So I'm going to go through the whole track now, clean up those kicks so that they're not going at the same time as the snare, and then I'll show you what I'll do next from there. So now we're going to cover what most people think of when they think of drum editing, which is quantizing the drums for timing. Now, one thing I'd like to note is my approach towards editing drums for timing really varies on a project by project basis. If I'm working on something that's more rock oriented or a slower vibe, sometimes I don't need to do any time editing at all. If it passes the ear test and it sounds tight, then that's good enough. For most styles of metal, I'm editing the kick and snare to the grid, but will often leave the fills natural and not touch them to keep some of the feel. In this case, working with a more extreme style of metal, where precision is really the expectation, this is about as heavy-handed as I go with time editing, where I'm literally quantizing every single hit of the drum to the grid. So let's go check it out. You can see I went through and removed the kicks any time that they were playing at the exact same time the snare was. Now what I do is I consolidate these two guide tracks into a stereo track, and I pan the kick all the way to the left and the snare all the way to the right. And I'll print that out, and it just makes it really clear where you'll see your kick hits versus your snare hits on the guide track. Okay, so here we have that here. Get rid of those. So here is what we're going to be using to trigger the stretch markers in Reaper. Now, one last thing I do before I start adding the stretch markers is I will slightly time shift these tracks ahead. And my reasoning for that is you can even see on the waveform, like look at the kick. With the dynamic split that you use in Reaper to set up the stretch markers, it often doesn't catch the transient until slightly after the initial transient hits. Like it'll add the stretch marker, say about here. And we don't want to leave that in, because then when we're locking everything to the grid, it's going to miss that beginning part of the transient. It's going to squash it in or stretch it out, and it's not going to sound natural. By shifting those guide tracks ahead slightly, when it adds a stretch marker, even if it adds it here, on the actual tracks, it'll be placing it right at the front of the transient. So I'll show you how I go about doing this, and you'll see what I mean. So now we have it. We're going to hit D for dynamic split. And I don't really touch the settings here. The only thing I really adjust is the threshold, but let me look. It looks like it's adding stretch markers right where we want it, but let's look. Like, for instance, here in the snare, you see how it's putting it here, the stretch marker, instead of right there. But where I have it set up, you'll see on the actual snare track, that's going to be landing right in front. So that's why I do that time shift. So yeah, I'm going to highlight everything, group them, and we're going to click to add stretch markers to the selected items and grouped items. And there you go. Now it added stretch markers to all my groups. I can delete this. Then what I do is I just set the grid to what I want to lock the stretch markers to. So we'll start off at 16th notes, and we'll just start going through. Like here, I'll just show you a quick section. You could just highlight a section like this, and I have it set up that if I hit Shift D, it'll lock all those stretch markers to the grid in that section, as you see there. Now it shifted it. So I'm gonna go through the whole song. I'll get the kick and snare real tight, and then I'll show you what I do next. So I went through, edited the kick and snare, and you can hear how tight it's sounding now. Now there's one last step I do for the time editing, and that is going through and manually placing stretch markers on the toms for the fills to get those as tight as possible. So you see I'll add them here, and then we could just go section by section, get those fills tight. Miss this one here. So I'll go through the rest of the song, get all those fills tight, and I'll also be checking if there's any sections where he's not playing a lot of kick and snare, but he is playing on the cymbals. I'll check and do the same thing like I'm doing on the toms and make sure each cymbal hit is to the grid. So I'm gonna go do that now, get the rest of the song completely locked in, and then I'll check back in. Now the last thing I like to do when editing is create MIDI tracks for both my kick and snare so that come mix time, if I want to use samples, I already have the MIDI there waiting for me. So let me show you how I tackle that. I finished all the time editing. You can see here everything is real tight to the grid. Now the kicks, snares. I'll play some of this back so you can hear how tight it sounds now after doing all that drum editing. So super tight. Now the last thing I like to do in the editing stage is add MIDI for my kick and my snare. Now my reason for doing that is I want to have the option to use samples come mix time. Now I may use them, I may not, but once I get into the mixing mindset, I don't want to wind up having to go back if I needed samples and have to get MIDI for it, do the whole thing. I like to be that when I'm in my mixing mindset, that's all I'm focusing on, nothing that could be done in the editing stage. So I always like to provide myself with a MIDI for kick and snare. I almost never ever have to sample replace toms. The only time I ever find that I have to replace toms would be either a really bad sounding kit, poorly mic'd, or really terrible performance. But if you're a halfway decent drummer and you're recording it halfway decently, you should get away without ever having to use samples on toms. So I tend to only do the MIDI for the kick and the snare. Now the way I go about getting the MIDI is I will load an instance of trigger 2 on the kick. So I have that open here. I have the kick soloed, and I'm just looking to see where it's going to trigger the MIDI nicely. So I'll probably boost the volume up. Good, that looks like we're getting it at a good level. So I'll clear that. What I'll do is I usually render out the track so that it gets to go through the entire process of mapping the MIDI. And then I just go and drag the MIDI onto the track. And then what I'll do next is go through, it's painstaking, but this is what separates a pro sounding drum edit versus an amateur one, is I go and make sure every single MIDI note is lining up perfectly with the initial transient of the kick. So going by each one and checking, and I could already tell I need to shift all these just a little bit. And so I'll go through the whole thing, check that, and you usually find, especially if there's really tight like double kick stuff, or in this instance, we want missing the kick there. So I'll go in and I'll manually add that MIDI note in like this. Oops, don't have that locked to the grid. There we go. So I'm going to go through the kick and do this, and what you just saw me doing the kick, I do the exact same thing on the snare. So let me go through this, get all the MIDI perfectly mapped, and then I'll show you the last thing I do with the MIDI. All right, the final step with the MIDI. I went through, everything's locked in, exactly in time with the actual performance. Now, if I'm going to use a kick sample, I usually want that to be super consistent. So for the MIDI for that, I'll usually set it and leave it at 127. My thought process behind that is, especially with this style of metal, that extreme style of metal, you want the kick to be super consistent. So I'll blend in the actual kick with the sample, if I do wind up using a sample. Usually I don't go above more than a 50-50 blend. So what I do is I use the sample to be super consistent, basically like hitting it at a full 127 the entire time, and then blending in that natural kick with it. That will create some variation and dynamics within the performance, so it doesn't sound like a machine gun going the whole time. Now, if there was a section in the song that was more dynamic, if they had like a softer melodic part of the song where the kick needs to be at a lower velocity, then I would do it. But a song like this where it's pretty much an all-out assault, I want a kick sample, if I'm going to use it, to be super consistent. So I'll just leave it at 127 and then just blend in the natural kick to get some of that feel back. Now, I can't do that with the snare because the snare is very, very dynamic. Like right in the intro, if we listen to what he's playing for the snare, if I left the MIDI at 127, it would sound like this. That's terrible. So I'll just go through this one section and I'll show you how I try and mimic the actual performance with the MIDI. You can see here where he's kind of accenting harder snare hits. So I'll go into the actual MIDI, and just for a quick demonstration purpose, I'll leave that first one, and then we'll kind of lower these other ones. Now I'm just doing this super quick just to kind of demonstrate. But even with that, if we compare now, after making some velocity changes, listening to the actual snare again, and then just a quick, just for reference, what I did. So yeah, I'll have to fine tune it, but I'll go through it and try and match the performance as best I can so that if I do wind up using any snare samples in this song, the samples it triggers will be close to the feel of the actual performance. So there you have it. That's my complete drum editing process inside of Reaper. Just a quick recap. We fixed any phase issues. We removed the bleed from all the close mics. We created guide tracks to set up our stretch markers. We quantized the drums, and then we created MIDI for the kick and snare. Try this on your next mix and let me know if it helped you out. If you're interested in having me mix your band, I'm currently taking new clients. There's a link to my mixing services in the description below. Thanks for watching, and if you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. I'll catch you on the next one.